The sirens started wailing at 3:47 p.m. on that sweltering August afternoon, cutting through the lazy summer air of Casey, Illinois like a knife through butter. By the time the ambulance reached Maple Street, half the town had already gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion and the kind of small-town curiosity that makes front-page news out of a cat stuck in a tree. But this wasn't a cat in a tree. This was Jenny Mae Patterson, giving birth on the pristine front lawn of the man who had fired her for being pregnant just 3 months earlier. And as little Hope Patterson took her first breath under the shade of a century-old oak tree, surrounded by the entire population of Casey's East Side, everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would change their small town forever. What they didn't know was that this moment, this perfect storm of justice and irony, had been building for months. They didn't know about the secretly recorded conversations, the systematic harassment, or the federal investigation that would soon sweep through their quiet farming community like a tornado through a wheat field. All they knew was that Harold Hank Morrison, Casey's most prominent businessman and aspiring mayor, was standing frozen on his own front porch, watching his carefully constructed world crumble with each of Hope's healthy cries. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. Small-town folks are careful about taking sides, especially when it involves prominent families and local politics. But as the story unfolded over the following weeks, as the truth emerged through court documents and newspaper headlines, that crowd would become an army of supporters for a young woman who had dared to stand up to the most powerful man in town. This is the story of how a pregnancy became a revolution, how a birth became a reckoning, and how the smallest town in Illinois proved that sometimes the biggest changes start in the most unlikely places. My name is Jenny Mae Patterson, and for the first 28 years of my life, I thought I had everything figured out. Born and raised in Casey, Illinois, population 2,762 on a good day, I was what folks around here called a golden girl. Valedictorian of Casey High School, full scholarship to Eastern Illinois University, back home with a business degree and dreams bigger than our county fair. When I landed the job as marketing director at Morrison Agricultural Services, it felt like destiny. The company was Casey's largest employer, founded by Harold Morrison Sr. in 1952 and now run by his son, Harold Hank Morrison Jr. For a small-town girl with big ambitions, it was the perfect launching pad. Hank Morrison was everything you'd expect from a third-generation businessman in rural Illinois. At 47, he had the kind of presence that commanded respect, tall, silver-haired, always dressed in pressed khakis and polo shirts embroidered with the company logo. He drove a brand-new Ford F-150 King Ranch Edition, lived in the biggest house on Maple Street, and had his sights set on becoming Casey's next mayor. For 3 years, I was his star employee. I modernized the company's marketing, brought in new clients from as far away as Chicago, and helped increase annual revenue by 35%. Hank loved to introduce me at Chamber of Commerce meetings as our homegrown success story and proof that Casey's brightest don't have to leave home to shine. I worked 60-hour weeks without complaint, missed family dinners to handle client emergencies, and poured my heart into building Morrison Agricultural Services into a regional powerhouse. When Hank promoted me to senior marketing director and gave me a 20% raise, I felt like I was living the American dream in my own backyard. Then I met Billy Patterson. Billy was a mechanic at Peterson's Auto Shop, the kind of man who could fix anything with wheels and had a smile that could light up the darkest Illinois winter. We met at the Casey Popcorn Festival, because of course we did, and were married 18 months later in a ceremony that half the town attended. Billy understood my ambitions and supported my career, even when it meant late nights and weekend work. He'd bring me dinner at the office, help me stuff envelopes for direct mail campaigns, and listen patiently as I explained marketing strategies he probably couldn't care less about. "You're going to run this whole company someday," he'd say, kissing my forehead as I worked late into the night. Hank Morrison better watch out. He's got a tiger working for him. I loved Billy's confidence in me, but I also knew the reality of small-town business. Morrison Agricultural Services was a family company, and I wasn't family. Still, I believed that hard work and results would eventually be rewarded, that loyalty would be recognized, and that my contributions would secure my place in Casey's business community. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The pregnancy test showed positive on a cold February morning, and I stared at those 2 pink lines with a mixture of joy and terror. Billy and I had been trying for a baby for 6 months, but now that it was real, I couldn't stop thinking about work. Morrison Agricultural Services didn't exactly have a progressive family leave policy. In fact, we didn't have much of a policy at all. The company employed 47 people, mostly men, and in the 3 years I'd worked there, only 2 women had taken maternity leave. Both had been administrative assistants, and both had quietly returned to reduced hours and lower pay. But I was different. I was senior marketing director, the person who brought in the big clients and managed the company's public image. Surely my position was secure enough to weather a pregnancy. I decided to tell Hank immediately, believing that early communication and careful planning would demonstrate my professionalism and commitment to the company. I scheduled a meeting for the following Monday, prepared a detailed transition plan, and rehearsed my announcement to sound confident and reassuring. Monday morning arrived with a brutal wind chill that made Casey feel like the surface of Mars. I arrived at the office early, as always, and spent an hour reviewing client accounts and preparing for the day's meetings. At 9 a.m. sharp, I knocked on Hank's corner office door. "Come in, Jenny May," he called, looking up from his computer with the warm smile that had always made me feel valued and appreciated. "What's on your mind this morning?" I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd received my promotion, my raise, and countless words of encouragement over the years. The office was decorated with photos of Hank's family, his wife Martha, their twin boys now in college, and various hunting and fishing trophies that screamed successful small-town businessman. "Hank, I have some wonderful news to share," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Billy and I are expecting our first child. I'm about 8 weeks along." The change in his expression was immediate and devastating. The warm smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk, and stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Well," he said slowly, "that's certainly news." The word news hung in the air like a curse. This wasn't the congratulations I'd expected, or even the mild concern about work schedules I'd prepared for. This was something else entirely. "I want to assure you that this won't affect my work performance," I continued quickly, launching into the speech I'd rehearsed. "I'm feeling great, no morning sickness, and I'm planning to work right up until my due date. I've already researched Illinois family leave laws and prepared a comprehensive transition plan for it." "Jenny May," Hank interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is a significant development that will require careful consideration. Why don't you take the rest of the day to think about the implications, and we'll discuss this further later this week." I felt like I'd been slapped. In 3 years of employment, Hank had never dismissed me from a meeting or suggested I needed time to think about implications. I was being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a valued employee sharing good news. Of course, I managed to say, standing on unsteady legs, "I'll be in my office if you need anything." As I reached the door, Hank's voice stopped me cold. "Jenny May, you might want to consider what's best for everyone involved. Big changes require big decisions." I walked back to my office in a daze, my mind racing to process what had just happened. The man who had been my mentor, my advocate, and my biggest professional supporter had just made it clear that my pregnancy was a problem he intended to solve. I had no idea how quickly that solution would unfold. The changes started the very next day, subtle at first but unmistakably deliberate. The weekly marketing meeting was moved to Thursday morning without notifying me, and when I arrived at the conference room to find it empty, Hank's assistant Susan Miller apologized and said there had been a scheduling conflict. By the time I tracked down the meeting, it was over. The team had made decisions about 3 major campaigns without my input, and when I asked Hank about it later, he claimed he'd sent me an email about the schedule change. "Check your spam folder," he suggested with a shrug. Technology can be unreliable. The email was never found, but the pattern was established. Over the next 2 weeks, I was mysteriously left out of client calls, excluded from strategic planning sessions, and removed from email chains I'd been part of for years. When I confronted Hank about these oversights, he always had reasonable explanations. "We're trying to reduce your stress level during the pregnancy. These clients specifically requested to work with Robert. I thought you might appreciate a lighter workload." But I knew what was really happening. My pregnancy had transformed me from an asset into a liability, and Hank was systematically erasing me from the company's operations. The most devastating blow came when the Heartland Feed and Grain account, a $200,000 client I'd landed and managed for 2 years, was transferred to Robert Thompson, a junior marketing associate who'd been with the company for 8 months. When I asked Hank about the transfer, his explanation was both insulting and revealing. Robert has more flexibility for the extensive farm visits this account requires, he said. I'm sure you understand that traveling to rural locations during pregnancy could be risky. I've been visiting farms my entire career, I protested. I grew up on a farm. I know these clients personally. Nevertheless, Hank replied, his tone final, we need to prioritize your health and safety. I'm sure you want what's best for the baby. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He was using my pregnancy as a weapon against me, wrapping discrimination in the language of concern and protection. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and told Billy everything. My husband listened with growing anger, his jaw clenching as I described each humiliation and professional slight. This is illegal, he said finally. You can't fire someone for being pregnant. He's not firing me, I replied. He's destroying my job from the inside out, making me so ineffective that termination will look justified. Billy reached across the table and took my hand. We need to document everything. Dates, times, witnesses. If this goes where I think it's going, you'll need evidence. I started keeping detailed records of every interaction with Hank, every project reassignment, every meeting I was excluded from. I saved emails, made notes about conversations, and began building a timeline of discrimination that would eventually become the foundation of a federal lawsuit. But documentation couldn't stop the professional bleeding. Within a month of my pregnancy announcement, I'd lost 70% of my key responsibilities. My corner office was moved to a cramped space near the supply closet. My company credit card was revoked due to budget restructuring. My direct reports were reassigned to other managers. Meanwhile, Hank hired 2 new marketing associates, both young, single men fresh out of college. When I offered to train them or share institutional knowledge, I was told they were being brought up to speed by the senior team. The isolation was as devastating as the professional marginalization. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed uncomfortable around me. I later learned that Hank had been telling people I was struggling with pregnancy complications and might need to take extended leave at any moment. Susan Miller, who had been my friend and ally, started avoiding eye contact. Robert Thompson, who had once sought my advice on client management, now acted like I was invisible. Even the delivery drivers who had always stopped to chat suddenly seemed to be in a hurry. The message was clear. I was being erased from Morrison Agricultural Services, one day at a time. The final piece of Hank's strategy arrived in my email inbox on a Tuesday morning in May. It was a meeting request from Susan Miller for a routine performance evaluation, scheduled for the following Friday at 2 p.m. The timing was suspicious. My annual review wasn't due for another 4 months, and Hank had never conducted mid-year evaluations before. But I hoped that maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to address the issues I'd been experiencing and get our professional relationship back on track. I prepared for the meeting like I was defending my dissertation. I gathered performance metrics, client testimonials, and documentation of every project I'd successfully managed over the past year. I created a presentation highlighting my contributions to the company's growth and profitability, determined to remind Hank of my value as an employee. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that makes Illinois summers feel like living inside a wet wool blanket. I walked into the conference room expecting a one-on-one discussion and found Hank seated at the head of the table with 2 other people I didn't recognize. "Jenny May, please sit down," Hank said, his tone professionally neutral, but his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I'd like you to meet Patricia Walsh from our insurance company and David Chun, our new legal consultant." My heart sank. Insurance representatives and lawyers weren't brought in for routine performance reviews. They were brought in for terminations. "We need to discuss some concerns about your recent performance," Hank continued, sliding a thick folder across the table. "These issues have been developing over the past several months." The performance review was a masterpiece of manipulation. Every project I'd been removed from was listed as abandoned or inadequately managed. Client relationships I'd been prevented from maintaining were described as deteriorating due to lack of attention. My reduced workload was presented as evidence of decreased productivity and engagement. Each accusation was technically true, but completely lacking context. Yes, I had abandoned projects after being explicitly told they were being reassigned. Yes, client relationships had deteriorated after I was excluded from meetings and communications. Yes, my productivity had decreased after my responsibilities were systematically stripped away. This is completely false, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You reassigned my projects. You excluded me from client meetings. You've systematically removed my responsibilities, and now you're blaming me for the results. Patricia Walsh, a stern woman in her 50s, glanced uncomfortably between Hank and me. Mr. Morrison has provided extensive documentation of performance issues, she said quietly. These concerns need to be addressed before they affect the company's insurance coverage. The legal consultant, David Chun, leaned forward with the predatory smile of a shark sensing blood. Miss Patterson, pregnancy can certainly affect workplace performance. Perhaps it would be beneficial for everyone if you considered taking early leave to focus on your health and family preparation. I'm not taking early leave, I said firmly. I'm perfectly capable of performing my job. What I can't do is succeed when I'm being deliberately sabotaged. Hank's mask of professional concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Jenny May, I understand that pregnancy can make women emotional. Perhaps you're not seeing the situation clearly. The condescension in his voice was like a slap across the face. He was dismissing my legitimate concerns as pregnancy emotions, using the oldest sexist trope in the book to undermine my credibility. The meeting ended with a formal warning placed in my personnel file and a 30-day performance improvement plan that set impossible targets given my reduced responsibilities. It was clear that Hank was building a case for termination, creating a paper trail that would make my firing look justified. As I walked back to my cramped office, I passed the conference room where Hank was still meeting with his consultants. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear fragments of their conversation. Pregnant employees are always a liability. Need to document everything carefully. Can't afford to have her claiming discrimination. I stopped outside the door, my heart pounding, and listened as Hank laid out his strategy for my termination. What I heard would later become the cornerstone of a federal lawsuit, but in that moment, it just felt like the final betrayal by someone I had trusted and respected. What Hank didn't know was that I had an ally inside Morrison Agricultural Services. Tommy Williams, a 24-year-old IT technician who handled the company's computers and phone systems, had been quietly documenting what he called the Jenny May situation for weeks. Tommy was the kind of person who faded into the background of office life, quiet, competent, and largely invisible to management. But he had a strong sense of justice and a talent for being in the right place at the right time with the right equipment. 2 days after my devastating performance review, Tommy approached me in the parking lot after work. He looked nervous, glancing around to make sure we weren't being observed. Mrs. Patterson, he said quietly, I think you should know that I've been recording Mr. Morrison's conversations about you. He's been saying things that, well, they're not right. My heart stopped. What kind of things? Tommy pulled out a small digital recorder and looked around nervously. He's been talking to other business owners about how to handle what he calls the pregnancy problem. He's been bragging about how he's going to use your case as a model for getting rid of employees who might become expensive due to family issues. He pressed play, and Hank's voice filled the air. The trick is to make it look like performance issues. You can't just fire them for being pregnant. That's illegal. But you can make their job impossible, document every failure, and build a case for termination based on inadequate performance. These women think they can have it all, but biology doesn't care about their career ambitions. I felt sick. This was worse than I had imagined. Hank wasn't just discriminating against me. He was developing a systematic approach to eliminating pregnant employees and sharing it with other employers. Tommy had more recordings, each one more damning than the last. Hank discussing with other managers how to manage out employees who might become burdens due to pregnancy. him laughing about how I'd fallen for the performance review trap. Most devastating of all, a conversation where he explicitly stated that pregnant women were dead weight, and that companies needed to find creative ways to eliminate them before they cost too much money. "Why are you doing this?" I asked Tommy. "This could cost you your job." He looked at me with the kind of earnest sincerity that reminded me why I loved small-town people. My sister went through something similar at her job in Springfield. She didn't have any proof, so she just had to take it. "But you don't have to. This is wrong, Mrs. Patterson, and someone needs to stand up for what's right." Tommy's courage gave me hope, but it also made me realize how high the stakes had become. We weren't just fighting for my job. We were fighting against a systematic pattern of discrimination that could affect every working woman in Casey. With Tommy's recordings and my meticulously documented timeline, I hired Patricia Coleman, an employment attorney from Springfield who specialized in pregnancy discrimination cases. Patricia reviewed the materials with growing excitement and mounting anger. "This is extraordinary evidence," she said during our first meeting. "Most pregnancy discrimination cases rely on circumstantial evidence and pattern recognition. You have explicit admissions of discriminatory intent. This isn't just wrongful termination, it's a federal civil rights violation." But Patricia had discovered something even more interesting about Morrison Agricultural Services. The company had received significant federal agricultural subsidies and tax incentives based on their stated commitment to equal opportunity employment. Hank's discrimination wasn't just illegal, it was fraudulent misrepresentation to the government. "We're not just going after Morrison Agricultural Services," Patricia explained. "We're going after the entire pattern of discrimination that your case represents, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." The case began to take shape. Wrongful termination, pregnancy discrimination, hostile work environment, and federal fraud. But Patricia had one more surprise. "I've been researching Harold Morrison personally," she said. "He's running for mayor on a platform of family values and small business support. He's been giving speeches about the importance of supporting working families. The hypocrisy is staggering." That's when the plan began to crystallize. Hank had destroyed my career and reputation in the most public way possible, using his position of power to isolate me from the community I loved. Maybe it was time to return the favor. Hank's mayoral campaign was everything you'd expect from a small-town politician with big ambitions. His campaign materials featured photos of him with his wife Martha and their twin boys, along with slogans like "Strong Families," "Strong Casey," and "A Leader Who Understands Working People." He held coffee hours at Donna's Diner, attended every church function and school event, and made speeches about the importance of supporting local businesses and working families. The irony was almost too perfect. Here was a man who had terminated me for being pregnant, now asking voters to trust him to represent their interests. Meanwhile, my own situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The stress of the legal case and the ongoing harassment at work was affecting my pregnancy. My doctor, Rebecca Foster, had been monitoring my condition and was concerned about the impact of workplace stress on my health. "Your blood pressure is elevated, and you're showing signs of pregnancy-related anxiety," she said during one of my appointments. "The stress you're experiencing at work is affecting both you and the baby. We need to find ways to reduce your stress levels, or we might be looking at complications." I was due in early August, right in the middle of Hank's campaign season. As my due date approached, I started experiencing false labor pains and making frequent trips to the emergency room. Each visit was a reminder of how Hank's discrimination had invaded every aspect of my life. The call came on a sweltering Friday afternoon in July when I was 36 weeks pregnant. Susan Miller requested an urgent meeting to discuss my employment status. I knew what was coming, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Hank was waiting in the conference room with Susan, Patricia Walsh from the insurance company, and David Chin, the legal consultant. The termination letter was already prepared, citing failure to meet performance standards and inability to fulfill essential job functions. "This is pregnancy discrimination," I said, fighting back tears of rage and frustration. "Everything you've done since I announced my pregnancy has been designed to create grounds for firing me." David Chin leaned forward with his predatory smile. "Miss Patterson, the company has documented performance issues that clearly justify this termination. This decision is based solely on job performance and business needs. What performance issues? I demanded. Show me one documented concern from before February 18th. Show me one client complaint, one missed deadline, one example of inadequate work. The silence in the room was deafening. They couldn't provide evidence because there wasn't any. My performance had been exemplary until the moment I announced my pregnancy. Hank finally spoke, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Jenny May, I think it's best for everyone if we part ways amicably. We're prepared to offer a generous severance package in exchange for your agreement not to pursue any legal action. The severance offer was substantial, 4-month salary plus benefits. It was clearly designed to make a lawsuit seem unnecessary and expensive. But I could see the trap. Accepting would mean admitting that the termination was legitimate and abandoning any claim to justice. I'm not signing anything, I said, standing up with as much dignity as I could muster at 36 weeks pregnant. You'll be hearing from my attorney. Hank's professional mask finally slipped completely. Good luck proving anything, Jenny May. You're damaged goods now. No one in this town is going to hire a pregnant woman who couldn't handle her last job. Those words would haunt me for weeks, but they also steeled my resolve. Hank had just revealed his true motivation and, more importantly, made a threat that could be used against him in court. Hank's biggest campaign event was scheduled for Saturday, August 12th, a neighborhood barbecue at his house on Maple Street where he planned to announce his policy platform. The event was heavily promoted in the KC Chronicle and on social media, with promises of family-friendly activities and opportunities to meet the candidate personally. I was 38 weeks pregnant and experiencing increasingly frequent contractions. Dr. Foster had warned me that labor could start at any time, and I should be prepared to get to the hospital in Effingham quickly. On the morning of August 12th, I woke up to strong, regular contractions. Billy wanted to drive straight to the hospital, but I had a different idea. Let's drive past Hank's house first, I suggested. I want to see this Family Values campaign event for myself. Billy looked at me suspiciously. Jenny May, you're in labor. This is not the time for political activism. I'm just curious, I said innocently. Maple Street is on the way to the highway anyway. We drove toward Hank's house, following the hand-painted signs directing visitors to the campaign barbecue. The street was lined with cars, and his front yard was filled with families, campaign volunteers, and what looked like half the population of KC. A large banner reading Hank Morrison, Strong Families, Strong KC, was strung between two maple trees. As we pulled up to the curb directly in front of the house, another contraction hit, stronger than any I'd experienced. I gripped Billy's hand and suddenly realized this was it. The baby was coming, and we weren't going to make it to Effingham. Billy, I gasped, I think the baby's coming right now. What happened next wasn't planned, but it was perfect. As I went into active labor in our pickup truck parked directly in front of Hank's house, Billy called 911 while I focused on breathing through the contractions. The first person to notice something was wrong was Dorothy Peterson, who ran the local flower shop and had been manning the campaign volunteer table. She saw Billy frantically talking on his phone and immediately came over to investigate. What's happening? She asked, peering through the truck window. The baby's coming, Billy said, his voice tight with panic. Right now. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around our truck. Dorothy started directing traffic, calling for anyone with medical training. Sarah Mitchell, a retired nurse who had been enjoying the barbecue, immediately took charge of the situation. We need to get her inside, someone shouted. No time, Sarah replied, assessing my condition with practiced efficiency. This baby is coming right now. As word spread through the crowd that a woman was giving birth in the truck outside, more people gathered. Someone brought blankets from the house. Dorothy called for additional medical support. Campaign volunteers started organizing the growing crowd and keeping curious onlookers at a respectful distance. And then Hank appeared. He pushed through the crowd, clearly irritated by the disruption to his carefully planned event. When he saw me in the truck, his face went white as fresh snow. Jenny May? What are you doing here? Before I could answer, another contraction hit, and Sarah announced that the baby was crowning. We need to deliver this baby right here, right now, she said firmly. The next few minutes were simultaneously the most terrifying and most beautiful of my life. Surrounded by neighbors and strangers in front of the house of the man who had fired me, I gave birth to my daughter Hope on the front lawn of Hank Morrison's campaign headquarters. The crowd that had gathered for Hank's political event became an impromptu support network. People held blankets to provide privacy, called for additional medical support, and created a protective circle around our impromptu delivery room. Dr. Janet Reynolds, who had been attending the barbecue with her family, arrived just as Hope was taking her first breath. She checked both of us quickly and pronounced everything perfect. "You have a beautiful, healthy daughter," she said, placing Hope in my arms. "And you did an amazing job." As Hope let out her first cry, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. It was a moment of pure joy and community support that stood in stark contrast to the isolation and hostility I'd experienced at work. Hank stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. His campaign event had been completely overshadowed by a birth that was drawing more attention than any political speech ever could. Local photographer Mike Johnson, who had been hired to document the campaign event, quickly realized he had a much more compelling story. Within minutes, photos of Hope's birth were being shared on social media and sent to news outlets across Illinois. The story of the campaign birth spread through Casey like wildfire, then across Illinois, and eventually nationwide. The initial coverage focused on the heartwarming community response and the medical professionals who had stepped up to help. But as reporters began investigating the background, they discovered the connection between Hank and me. Baby born at mayoral candidate's event became fired employee gives birth on former boss's lawn, as journalists pieced together the full story. The irony of a family values candidate whose own employee had given birth on his property after being terminated for pregnancy was too perfect for media outlets to ignore. Patricia Coleman, my attorney, had been monitoring the news coverage and immediately recognized the public relations opportunity. "This is exactly the kind of story that changes public perception," she said. "Morrison can't hide behind corporate lawyers and HR departments now. This is personal, public, and undeniable." The recordings Tommy had provided were released to select media outlets, allowing reporters to present the full context of Hank's discrimination. The contrast between his campaign promises to support working families and his actual treatment of a pregnant employee created a narrative that resonated far beyond Casey's city limits. Casey, Illinois had never experienced anything like the media attention that followed Hope's birth. Reporters from Chicago, St. Louis, and even national news outlets descended on our small town, interviewing residents and business owners about the Morrison campaign and the pregnancy discrimination case. The town's response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours of Hope's birth, Hank's campaign headquarters was surrounded by protesters carrying signs reading "Support Working Mothers" and "Casey Values Real Families." The local Methodist church, where Hank had been a prominent member, issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. Most devastating of all, his own employees began speaking out. Robert Thompson, who had been given my Heartland feed and grain account, publicly apologized for his role in my marginalization. Susan Miller resigned from her position and provided additional evidence of Hank's discriminatory practices. "I was afraid to speak up before," Susan said in an interview with the Casey Chronicle. "But seeing Jenny May give birth on that lawn, knowing what she'd been through, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The business community's response was equally damaging. Several major clients canceled their contracts with Morrison Agricultural Services, citing concerns about the company's treatment of employees. The Casey Chamber of Commerce revoked Hank's membership and removed him from their board of directors. Hank's mayoral campaign never recovered from the birth on his lawn. The image of me giving birth while he stood by helplessly became a symbol of his poor judgment and lack of character. His own campaign materials, featuring his commitment to supporting working families, were now being used against him in news stories about pregnancy discrimination. Internal polling showed his support collapsing from 60% to 15% in less than a week. Campaign contributors began withdrawing their endorsements and demanding refunds. His campaign manager resigned, followed by most of his volunteers. The Casey Chronicle, which had endorsed Hank in the primary, published a scathing editorial calling for him to withdraw from the race. Harold Morrison has shown that his commitment to family values extends only to his own family. The editorial read, "Casey deserves better leadership." But Hank refused to withdraw, apparently believing he could weather the storm through sheer stubbornness. His defiance only made the situation worse, as it reinforced the perception that he was out of touch with community values. The mayoral race that Hank had been expected to win easily became a landslide victory for his opponent, Mary Williams, Tommy's aunt, and a longtime school board member who had built her campaign around actually supporting working families. With the media attention and overwhelming public support, our legal case became much stronger. Morrison Agricultural Services, facing federal investigation and potential criminal charges, quickly moved to settle out of court. The settlement was substantial: $300,000 in compensation for lost wages and emotional distress, plus mandatory policy changes to prevent future discrimination. The company was required to implement new training programs, establish an independent oversight committee for pregnancy-related issues, and create a scholarship fund for working mothers pursuing career development. Hank was personally liable for an additional $100,000 in punitive damages and was banned from serving in any management capacity at companies receiving federal contracts or subsidies. His business license was suspended pending a full investigation by the Illinois Department of Human Rights. Tommy Williams, who had risked his job to document the discrimination, was promoted to IT manager and became the company's new employee advocate. His courage in speaking up had not only vindicated me, but had created lasting change for future employees. Hope's birth on Hank's lawn became a catalyst for broader changes in Casey and throughout rural Illinois. The pediatrician who had helped during the birth, Dr. Janet Reynolds, started a nonprofit organization providing support for pregnant women facing workplace discrimination. The community that had witnessed Hope's birth embraced our story as a symbol of standing up for what's right. The house that Hank was eventually forced to sell was purchased by a young family who invited me to plant a garden in the same spot where Hope had been born. Most surprisingly, the media attention brought positive changes to Casey's economy. The story of a small town that stood up for a working mother attracted new businesses and residents who were drawn to our community values. Property values increased, and new jobs were created. Martha Morrison, Hank's wife, quietly divorced him and stayed in Casey with their sons. She became a vocal advocate for working women's rights and eventually ran for city council herself, winning easily on a platform of genuine family support. The months following Hope's birth were a whirlwind of change, not just for me, but for all of Casey. The town that had once felt so small and predictable had become a beacon of hope for those who believed in standing up for what's right. My daughter, Hope, was more than just my child. She was a symbol of what we could achieve when we refused to let injustice win. The legal settlement with Morrison Agricultural Services didn't just secure my family's future, it set a precedent. Other women in nearby towns began coming forward with their own stories of workplace discrimination. Patricia Coleman, my attorney, took on several of these cases, building on the evidence and momentum from my lawsuit. She started calling it the Casey Effect, a ripple of accountability spreading through rural Illinois and beyond. Tommy Williams became a local hero in his own right. His promotion to IT manager came with a new role as employee advocate, and he took it seriously. He implemented a system for anonymous reporting of workplace issues and worked with the new oversight committee to ensure that Morrison Agricultural Services followed through on its mandated reforms. Tommy also started speaking at regional business conferences, sharing his story of standing up to power and encouraging others to do the same. "You don't have to be loud to make a difference," he'd say. "You just have to be listening." Billy and I settled into life as new parents, though it wasn't without challenges. The stress of the past year had taken a toll, and there were nights when I'd wake up in a cold sweat, reliving the humiliation of Hank's performance review or the fear of labor in that pickup truck. But Billy was there every time, holding my hand and reminding me that we'd come through the worst of it together. Hope, with her bright eyes and infectious giggle, made every struggle worth it. The community continued to rally around us. Dorothy Peterson, the florist who had been the first to help during Hope's birth, organized a weekly support group for new mothers at her shop. Sarah Mitchell, the retired nurse, volunteered her time to teach prenatal care workshops. Even Robert Thompson, who had taken over my Heartland feed and grain account, became an unexpected ally. He reached out to apologize again, this time privately, and offered to help fund Dr. Janet Reynolds' nonprofit for working mothers. I was part of the problem, he told me. I want to be part of the solution now. Hank Morrison, meanwhile, faded from Casey's spotlight. After losing his business license and facing a federal investigation, he sold what remained of Morrison Agricultural Services to a cooperative of local farmers. The company was rebranded as Casey AgWorks, with a board that included employees like Tommy and a commitment to fair labor practices. Hank moved to a small apartment in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he kept a low profile. Rumor had it he was working as a consultant for a struggling grain supplier, a far cry from the powerful figure he'd once been. Martha Morrison's transformation was one of the most surprising outcomes. After her divorce, she stayed in Casey and threw herself into community work. Her city council campaign was a quiet one, focused on practical solutions like improving childcare access and supporting small businesses owned by women. When she won, she invited me to her swearing-in ceremony, where she publicly acknowledged my role in inspiring her to run. Ginny Mae showed us what courage looks like, she said in her speech. I'm here to make sure Casey lives up to her example. The garden I planted in the spot where Hope was born became a community landmark. The new owners of the Maple Street house, a young couple named the Carters, turned it into a small memorial garden with a plaque that read, Hope's Garden, a place of new beginnings. Every spring, the town held a small gathering there, planting flowers and sharing stories of resilience. It wasn't just about Hope's birth anymore. It was about what Casey had become. As for me, I didn't return to Morrison Agricultural Services even after its rebranding. Instead, I started my own marketing consultancy, working from home to balance motherhood and my career. My first clients were local businesses that had supported me during the lawsuit, and word of mouth quickly spread. Within a year, I was working with companies across Illinois, helping them build brands that valued their employees as much as their profits. It wasn't the path I'd planned, but it felt right, like I was finally living the dream I'd had all along, just in a different way. On Hope's first birthday, we held a small celebration in Hope's Garden. The Carters opened their yard to the community, and dozens of people showed up with balloons, homemade cakes, and stories of how the past year had changed them. Dr. Janet Reynolds brought a stack of pamphlets for her nonprofit, which had already helped over 50 women navigate workplace challenges. Tommy brought his sister from Springfield, who hugged me tightly and thanked me for giving her the courage to speak up about her own experience. Even Susan Miller came, looking lighter than I'd ever seen her, free from the weight of her silence. As the sun set and Hope toddled around the garden, chasing fireflies with Billy, I looked around at the faces of my neighbors and friends. This was Casey, not the town I'd grown up in, but the one we built together. A town that chose justice over silence, community over power, and hope over fear. And as I held my daughter close, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. Because in Casey, we learned that the smallest moments, like a birth on a summer lawn, could change everything. Thanks for listening to this powerful story. Subscribe for more stories about the surprising ways people change our lives for the better. See you in the next story.